Good day, everyone. Glad you have time to join us for this important, I think, really exciting session in the context of climate change, potentially the most exciting, sorry to EVs. So the idea of carbon offsets or voluntary carbon credits has been put forward for many years as potentially the most important element in reducing carbon emissions, certainly a crucial part of reducing carbon emissions and hitting net zero goals. And in particular, when it comes to an equitable transition, a fair transition, a just transition, which is very much on center stage at COP27 climate conference in Egypt right now. Now, that's been true in terms of how people have been talking about it for a very long time. In fact, I remember reading about this and being involved with this back in the 90s, and yet the market has mostly limped along and hasn't really developed and reached its full potential, particularly since 2009. And there have been some false starts. However, over the past couple of years, we've really seen a renaissance or an awakening in voluntary carbon markets and carbon offsets, and spectacular growth in interest and infrastructure to make this market really happen. At the same time, already, even as the market has started to take off, there has been a rash of allegations about greenwashing, and both because potentially some of the projects are not delivering the carbon savings that they're meant to be delivering, and then also because some companies might not be using these offsets in a proper way. So there's still challenges, but the potential seems closer than ever to being realized, I would argue. So that's what we're trying to answer today, or what I'm hoping to find out today. I'm certainly an offset enthusiast, but I'm not an expert. We're very fortunate to have three experts with us today to help answer these questions. What I'm looking to answer, one is, how big are the markets going to be? Two, and that would include both price and also how much in terms of tons of carbon we're going to be dealing with through carbon offsets. Two, who's involved? Who's buying credits? Who's selling credits? Who are the intermediaries? And what really is needed? And three, what are the existing remaining challenges and how are we going to get over them? And then four, finally, most important of all, is this actually going to help? And what can we do to make sure it helps to reduce emissions? Now, the three experts that we do have with us, first of all, Ralph Dixon next to me, and he's been with YTL for over 14 years, where he's heading up sustainability and environmental investments. He's also the CEO of the carbon subsidiary at YTL. So again, very long experience with carbon markets on multiple parts of the transactions. And then Leah with Macquarie on the carbon desk. Now, she is on our global carbon desk at Macquarie now, but has spent around 7 years, I believe, in voluntary carbon markets, including 4 years at South Pole, which is kind of one of the giants in the space and based out of Singapore. And then, of course, we have Omar, who, when we did the preparatory call last week, started off saying he's not an expert in carbon markets and quite vehemently, but then going on 30 minutes nonstop, going really into detail on some of the most important issues, lots of facts, and really kind of broke that down. And so I don't believe that he's not an expert, even if he does have a team of even greater experts. So given that, I think unlike EVs, unlike renewable energy, this is kind of off-piste for equity investors. So I'd like to start off, first of all, with just a 1 to 2 minute description from each of our panelists on what they're doing with carbon markets, how they interact with carbon markets, and then we'll kick off and get into those 4 big questions. So, Ralph.
Thanks very much, Charles. I'm not sure that I'm as expert as Leah and Umar, but we've been in the markets since 2007. And, you know, the clean development mechanism certainly taught us a lot of lessons about how things should be done and perhaps how they shouldn't be done. So during the time from 2012, when we've been twiddling our thumbs we've mainly been waiting for the carbon market to come back to life, and indeed it's come back to life with a real bang. You know, from 20 cents, I think that was the last price we saw in 2012, it shows that carbon markets do not function without a robust pricing, and of course the transfer of finance and technology, which was the original intent of the Clean Development Mechanism. It was to facilitate the transfer of both technology and finance. And when prices were 20 cents, obviously, we found that a lot of the projects just fell by the wayside. Those really good quality projects, methane avoidance projects in particular, there just wasn't sufficient revenue to cover the cost associated with monitoring, verification, and issuance of credits. So that taught us about the price, the importance of price. And of course, everybody was then mapping their inventory during that time, measuring in order to manage. And that allowed us to really build up that capacity in terms of finding out where we are, what we need to do. Now I think 90% of the global economy is covered under net zero, and around 140 countries have committed to net zero. So that's given a lot of underpinning to the markets. We feel that the markets will not falter from $20 to 20 cents like they did in 2012, but now they've got this very strong underpinning. We just saw the voluntary markets are around $2 billion US dollars now, expected to go to $100 billion. The compliance markets, largely dominated by the European ETS, is around $1 trillion at the moment, which will increase, but although at a slower pace. But what I think is important is show there has to be these strong mechanisms, the adherence to quality, integrity in the development of the markets to facilitate what we're seeing now is this real upswing in the registration of projects, both in the Verra Gold Standard, GCC space, renewable energy certificates. And whilst we don't necessarily advocate a high price, we see that as being a key component of the success of the markets. Thanks, Charles.
Thank you. And Claire.
Yes, I'm part of Macquarie's Global Carbon team, as mentioned, and what we really try to do is to cover the full value chain of offsets. So we're involved in the origination of carbon projects by providing equity finance or that finance to carbon projects, but also by providing technical support to carbon projects. We're also obviously involved in trading as well as in sales activities. And we're mostly covering the voluntary carbon market, but also involved in a number of compliance markets globally. And I think the kind of key tasks that we really want to do and how we want to support our clients with making their carbon procurement decisions is really supporting the market when it comes to price transparency, helping clients to really make informed decisions, to really understand the drivers of the carbon market, but also to provide them with market access and to be kind of a one platform that allows them to access voluntary as well as compliance markets.
Thank you. One more.
I think the key thing is we like to call ourselves the exchange, but actually what we're building with the voluntary carbon market is a market. And it's an integral piece of the journey Malaysia's undertaking towards net zero in valuing and providing a price for carbon. We don't have a carbon tax domestically. We don't have an emissions trading scheme. It is on the way. But engaging and creating real value for carbon is the key. And so we are, if you like, bringing together producers, projects, removing barriers in that regard, as well as also bringing in demand. And so we have a conversation. As I said on the call, building exchanges is easy. That's money and application of effort. Building a market, that's what we're about at the exchange. Creating opportunities, growing value, I think that might be our tagline.
Thank you very much. So let's step back first and away from abstractions and just go into, like, what are the projects that we're talking about? So let's talk about the sellers of projects. What kinds of projects are there? How do we differentiate these projects, and how do you decide which projects to get involved with? I think I'd go with Leah first, and then Ralph probably would also have additional views. And then, Omar, naturally, I'd like to learn what the exchange is looking to do to simplify this process and to make it more conducive to markets.
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. There are all sorts of projects out there, right? There are renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects, household projects such as cook stoves, water filters, and obviously nature-based solutions. And I think it's hard to say, these are the kind of projects that we really need, because it really depends on the location. For different jurisdictions, different kind of project types can make sense and can also be additional, which is one of the key words when it comes to carbon. As I mentioned earlier, we provide equity finance and debt financing to a number of carbon projects. And I mean, I think let's state the obvious up front, but there's no such thing as the perfect carbon project. Every project comes with different risks. So when we make a decision on whether we would want to invest in that project or not, for us, one of the key things is to really understand the risks that are associated with the project and to get comfortable in managing them. And there are a number of things that we would typically be looking at, including, where is the project based, what are the jurisdictional risks associated with it, which when we talk about nature-based solution is specifically important because you potentially invest in a project with a 20 years lifespan, potentially acquire concessions, you need to be really comfortable with the jurisdiction that you operate in. A second part could be to look into the developers who's actually developing the project on the ground and implementing it. How comfortable are you with them operating the project? Has the developer done such a project before? Have they done this kind of scale before? And have they succeeded? Another part you might want to look into is how do you actually engage with local communities? Were they consulted prior to starting the project? How are they involved? How are they benefiting? And then obviously we look at a number of facts like what's the ultimate project time frame, what are the underlying financials, what's the payback period, and so on. And once we kind of go step by step, we then again would make a decision whether we would be comfortable with the project, with the risks, and whether we believe this is a high quality project or not, and make a decision based on that.
Thank you. And Ralph, I gave you a blank slate just now, but I'm going to take that away. So specifically, YTL operates in multiple jurisdictions, and then also in your carbon consultancy side, you're dealing with other clients. If you're looking at assets or you're trying to offset carbon emissions in, say, Malaysia, do you need to buy credits in Malaysia and in Singapore, et cetera? Or are these fungible across borders? How does that play into consideration in addition to the types of projects that you're looking at?
Yeah, very good question. And I think Leah has mapped out the different types of credits, obviously, and the functions they perform. And just bringing into the picture an announcement last night from Bloomberg, Michael Bloomberg, who announced the Global Carbon Trust. He was talking particularly about the fungibility of credits. And I think it's something I discussed with Datu Umar was, are carbon credits a financial product or a commodity? And if they're a commodity like a 99.9 gold, then they're truly fungible. But clearly they're not. And I think Leah has made that quite clear in terms of the different characteristics of a project. You've got vintages, you've got location, you've got project type, you've got quality. We can see projects developed in a country where we see them listed on exchange, and then suddenly Silvera or B0 comes out with a very poor rating on that very project that's supposed to be fungible with another project, say, priced at a similar level. So a forestry project in Cambodia and Brazil, both priced around $10. The Brazilian project suddenly gets a very negative rating from Silvera. Clearly shows that all these characteristics show that it's not really a commodity. It's a financial product. And so for us, we are trying to navigate this. It's not an easy way or an easy space to try and figure out how we then normalize. So the Global Carbon Trust, the purpose is to normalize and make them fungible. But I think we're going to face increasing reality that they are a financial asset class. They're not a commodity.
Thank you. That's quite clear. And what do we do to clear that up, Omar?
It's an interesting point, Ralph. I won't disagree with you. I think it's in the eye of the beholder, as Leah quite rightly said. One of our challenges is, in the Malaysian context, is actually bringing on projects. And one of the conversations we've been having is around Article 6, national goals, NDC, offsets, and so on. And I think the key thing is, what are we looking to achieve with carbon credits? We're looking for additionality. We're looking for positive impact. I mean, I'm dumbing it down a little bit, if I may. Looking at the S part, are we reducing carbon footprints? And we then wrap that with some methodology, we quantify it, and then we offer it to market. Now, clearly, the underpinning of demand is the key. And it is actually aligned to each country's objective. So while it's a laudable objective to have a fungible product, it then needs to be seen in the context of the aspiration of each country. And particularly in the Malaysian context, we're looking to achieve our net zero objectives. And while we recognise from a federal level, this is our aspiration, this is our glide path, natural resources are owned by the states. And so we are navigating this conversation because asset owners want best price. We want corporates in Malaysia to offset on Malaysian credits. And so we're beginning to have that conversation and build the market. And hence, I think one of the key things, and I think Ralph just shared, when you have different products getting re-rated, I like to think in terms of schemes rather than projects. So verification becomes a more easier to do, and that's one of the things that we're looking at the Malaysian Forestry Fund, is how do we support state initiatives on a schemes basis rather than a project basis with commonality. So we have a little bit of work to do, but these are important conversations that are now taking place that had not taken place before. And so we're beginning to see a maturity growing in the market, and it's actually very exciting.
That's very interesting, and it leads to an interesting point as well. We're talking about voluntary carbon markets now, but I think you alluded to the evolution into kind of a compliance market ultimately, and being able to have these credits be backward integrated going forward. Which also comes to the question that we had at the beginning of this, the first question, which was how big are the markets going to get? So the options we had versus $2 billion last year, US dollars. 100 billion was the most common answer. That was the most popular answer in the group. Of course, there's no right answer. This was talking about 2050. I've seen targets or expectations for 100 billion US dollars by 2030, and expectations up to $1 trillion for carbon removal projects from the UN by 2050. And 500 billion was actually from Bloomberg New Energy Finance for 2050 as one of their scenarios, and they have multiple scenarios. So in order for that to happen, we need to think about the demand. And exactly where is the demand coming from? Ralph, you did mention net zero plans at the corporate level, and then, of course, we have the net zero plans at the national level. But what's really driving that today, and how do we see that evolving?
Thanks. So I think I mentioned earlier that roughly 90%, 140 countries, 90% of the companies in the formal economy have now committed to net zero. Clearly, we have to differentiate between carbon neutral, net zero, and SBTI. So carbon neutral allows the use of avoidance offsets and removal offsets. Net zero really only allows the use of removal offsets. And they can range anything from, your forestry projects at $8 a ton to your direct air capture projects at $2,000 a ton. So there's a huge range. In fact, there's probably even some cheaper vintages for the forestry projects from, say, previous years. And then, of course, you've got SBTI, where you can't use offsets. I I think they're considering scope 3.
Sorry, SBTI being...
Sorry, science-based targets, which means you commit to a science-based target. It's more of an onerous and you have to make a formal commitment and there's costs involved. But at the moment, SBTI states that you can't use removal or avoidance offsets, but they're considering, if I'm not wrong, Leah, considering the use of offsets for scope 3 potentially going forward, but we don't have visibility on that yet. So the demand will most likely come from those net zero, and that's going to accelerate. We've seen companies, organizations like Global Evergreening Alliance, New Forest, Rainforest Trust, some of the mangrove ones like WIF, TNC, the Nature Conservancy. I think Umar said, mangroves are a hugely important area, and especially Malaysia has a huge advantage there in terms of either protecting or developing those into carbon projects. And they are going to form the backbone of the removal projects, the wetlands, the peatlands, the salt marshes, the mangroves, etc. So I think the net zero commitments will underpin that demand, and I think we're going to see the acceleration of those type of projects.
Thank you. And it's come up already a few times, prices. So if we look at like the European compliance market, it's easy. You go onto a Bloomberg or FactSet or a Thomson Reuters or whatever, you can see that right now 1 ton of carbon is 78 euros, I think it was yesterday, or something thereabouts. Very straightforward. Voluntary markets, Ralph just gave the extreme range of prices. You can see things for under $1 per ton, up to multiple $1,000s per ton, or certainly multiple hundreds for direct air capture projects. And also, sorry, I naturally, when I flew from Singapore last night, I bought carbon offsets. I had to. And it cost 32 cents one way, so 64 cents US for my flight from Singapore round trip. And I believe it was going to mangrove projects in not sure where, and then also cook stove projects in Nepal. It felt intuitively pretty cheap. But how do we think about prices? Where do prices evolve? And how do we differentiate, given that it's such a broad range? I'll go with Leah first.
Yeah, sure. That's a really important question, and I think also a tricky one at the same time, because as you rightly pointed out, the voluntary market is rather complex. So I think if we were to look into the pricing of carbon offsets, there are obviously different parts that play a role, right? On the one side, you have the underlying project development costs, which obviously vary based on location, based on project types, based on various co-benefits that the project might have. And then on the other side, you have obviously the supply-demand situation and also the willingness from buyers to pay a premium for certain project types. And as Ralph mentioned earlier, most corporates in the voluntary market, they're buying offsets for their carbon neutrality or net zero commitment, because at the moment, technology may not allow them to fully decarbonize, so they need to use offsets as a transitioning tool. And then again, there are different kind of guidelines on what sort of offsets companies should procure, depending on what guidelines those companies follow. Some of the companies don't follow any guidelines. They procure based on what they believe is right for their communication strategy. But I would say in general, we do see that many corporates perceive credits such as nature-based solutions or cook stove projects as high quality, and are hence willing to pay a premium for that. Now, if we're looking into where the price is going to go in the future and how's the situation look like, I mean, there are a lot of forecasts out there, as you mentioned earlier as well, and most of them, what they're doing is they're looking at all the sustainability commitments, and then they're looking at the supply pipelines from the major voluntary registries like Verra and Gold Standard, and doing some forecasts based on that. However, there are a few additional things that one need to consider when making and forming an opinion about where the price will go, because one, we're still in a voluntary market. Will corporates really stick to their sustainability commitments? Two, how will technology evolve? some sectors might be much faster in decarbonizing than we actually expect and will hence require much less offsets than we maybe believe they will today. And then I think a third point, which is also quite important, is how will compliance market evolve over the next couple of years, and what percentage of the voluntary market will they potentially cover? And if they will cover certain emissions, then how will compliance markets interact with voluntary markets? Will companies compensate for emissions that already fall under compliance markets in addition with voluntary? Yes or no? So just to give you some flavor, I think there are a lot of other parameters that will play a role as well. But pricing, I think, in general is a rather complex topic. And I think in addition to just looking at forecasts, it's really important to understand the underlying drivers of the market when making a procurement decision.
I think Leah really hit on the point, which is the interplay when looking at pricing. Well, of course, it's demand and supply, and demand and supply will always find its own level. I think the key thing is the interplay between a voluntary market and emissions trading schemes, a compliance market. Now, Malaysia is a trading nation. Europe has CBAM coming. It's our third largest trading partner. So what does that mean for Malaysian corporates? So, and this is right on the cost and the price. So if we can use quality nature-based solutions to assist us in the offset, bearing in mind that CBAM will be a compliance market, they'll talk about how much you're allowed to pollute.
Sorry, CBAM for everybody.
Carbon equalisation tax, and within the European context. So the European market will be saying for exporters or exporters to the European market that there will be an allowable amount of carbon for your product. It'll be priced in and factored in a European context. So the question then becomes, from a Malaysian context, are our credits available to be used for that offset? Now, if they're available to use for an offset in the Malaysian context without an Article 6 offset agreement, which is, of course, something else that has to be navigated, it will then have a certain price point. Now, I think there's a more fundamental piece. Let's just wind it back a little bit. We're talking about price, market, demand. Actually, the real demand is coming from all of us on this call, consumers. That's actually the starting point. Now, governments are leading, but ourselves as citizens of planet Earth need to begin thinking what are our expectations. And while we focus on environment at the exchange, we also focus a lot on S, the social implication. We need to bring everyone along on this journey, and hence that equitable pivot to green, which is being discussed as well. Probably not now because there's a time difference, but it's all front of mind. It is something that we really need to think about. So when we look at pricing, there is the domestic piece, there is the international trading piece, which is very important. But more fundamental is what we are trying to achieve for our local communities. And from, if we look at Bursa, for example, we have ramped up and stepped out our disclosure, but we're looking to actually drive PLCs to move SMEs into green supply chains, working with banks. So very much repositioning the Malaysian economy, future-proofing the Malaysian economy. That's our aspiration. So it's not about not only just creating a market, but actually creating a fundamental shift in how we go about and do our business.
Thank you. And that hits on an incredibly important point for offsets in general. What the sort of projects that we see getting funded through offsets have so much more value than simply the carbon mitigation elements, right? It's quite a lot going on, whether from other environmental aspects, also social aspects. And that's what makes this exciting, is it's difficult to find other ways to finance these things. They exist, but it's very difficult as well. So I've heard the word green a few times. It would be remiss not to come into this and jump into greenwashing. Everyone wants to talk about it. No one wants to be accused of it. There are two parts to this, I think. I'd like to look at it from two parts. First of all, projects themselves. How can we determine whether the projects are legit? And then the second part would be, and that would be more from a corporate angle, and then from an investor angle, how can we look at companies to determine whether they're using the offsets correctly, or whether they're using the offsets in lieu of emissions reductions that they should be making, and instead they're just buying some offsets and continuing to pollute how they were. So the first part of the question, though, is what would be some guidelines you would give to corporates as they think about buying credits? What should they look for? And I think we go with Ralph first.
Thanks, Charles. There's obviously quite a few different rating agencies come up. I think I mentioned two of them before. Silvera and B0 are the two of the more common ones. Then you've got the Integrity Council, which obviously sets a bar or a standard. The registries themselves are setting far more stringent procedures. I think we can't talk too much about the audit process. All these systems, remember, we all were fairly dormant, or we went into a sort of a dormant state for many years. And so we see this massive ramping up, and there's been this incredible demand for expertise in this area. And audit area, the verification, VVBs, verification, and the validation bodies. The registries themselves, we know Vera was very short-staffed, and they have even now have a little bit of a backlog. But I think what they're doing is they're able to ramp up both their capacity as well as the level of checks in terms of the way they manage the process of registration of projects. So apart from the registries themselves, you're going to see a number of different organizations develop their own platforms, but it can't come away from the fact that you have to do your own individual due diligence on these projects. I don't think anything can really tear us away from the fact, if you're investing in equities, Dato' Umar would obviously have a much better take on this than me, but the amount of analysis, the amount of in-depth knowledge you have to have both on the integrity of the management, the integrity of the financial and non-financial reports. Projects are probably even more difficult. And as Leah said, some projects more difficult to verify than others. And this will, I think Singapore just announced the ICC, and obviously Singapore in 2 years' time is going to have 5% of their carbon tax payable in offsets as an option. And at $25 a ton, you can see they're only just touching at the small end of the scale. When you look at Uruguay and Sweden, and you're talking about $130 a ton, you can see there's a long way to go. So we know that there is independent, there's regulatory, there's everybody in the ecosystem is working hard to try and perfect this, but it doesn't take you away from the fact that each buyer has to conduct their own thorough due diligence.
Thank you, sir. I think that the real key, building on what Ralph was, we need to agree a standard. So in the Malaysian context, we're using Vera. Why? 70% of credits. We, of course, verify and we have a look at what is coming to market, and we'll be running our first auction in December. And we're seeding the market with, I say it, with offshore credits, because I don't have domestic credits. But we need to create a market and a price. That being said, it's an education process. So verification will be fundamental. And so it's about having clear, internationally recognized standards and bringing those standards to market and having it accepted by the market. And so we're moving to standardization in disclosure, we're moving to standardization in acceptance of what we consider to be a credit. And so there is a convergence. Now, is that convergence perhaps taking too long? Yes, but as more funds are available, investments increase, we will see that convergence actually, it will quicken. I'm not saying it's going to be exponential because we have many different moving parts, but we will move in that direction. But from a Malaysian context, international verifiable standards, we bring it to market, we seed our market, we then create demand, it then brings, it's a virtuous cycle. You then bring projects to life that create additionality we wouldn't otherwise see, Charles.
Thank you very much. And you've just said the dreaded word. We're trying, and admirably, I think, to avoid jargon and acronyms. This space is very rich in jargon, but additionality is one we can't avoid, unfortunately. And since you brought it up, Omar, you please feel free to address it. Anyone else, if you'd like to jump in.
Well, I think additionality is a little bit of a north-south conversation, Charles. Additionality is defined by our friends in the Northern Hemisphere and being opposed on us that have forests. And so I think there needs to be a greater debate in this regard. And so that gets back to we wish to have access to market. So what is additionality? Additionality is showing that the project actually reduces the amount of carbon. Now, that's an interesting conversation. If you've already cut down all your trees and you replant, then you have additionality. But if you leave your trees in situ, are you rewarded for good conduct? And I think that's a conversation that is taking place again. It's very front of mind. Now, it's a conversation that needs to take place for an equitable and just transition to a better world.
That's good. Thank you. Concise. Any-
Yeah, maybe just to add on, I think we already covered quite a few good points. I think in general, the recommendations that I would make to a corporate would be, as Ralph rightly mentioned, don't outsource your due diligence process. If you want to procure high quality credits, inform yourself about offsets, how projects work, what are important parameters for you, for your organization, and then I think it's really hard if you outsource the DD, because there might be a lack of information that you receive otherwise. And I think the other parts is really like align yourself with international guidelines and recommendations. There are also so many out there, like Science-Based Target Initiative, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the net zero, what are they called? Net zero principles for the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, that are telling you what offsets you should use when you want to achieve net zero. And really make sure you're aligned and you keep updated with that. I think we see many companies that are working on that also with consultants that can be a good help for them. And then I think the third part is really about being transparent in your communication on what you're doing. And I think many of what I've seen when companies were accused of greenwashing is also because some of them maybe weren't fully transparent, or some of the articles that were released were a bit misleading. So I think if you really demonstrate on what you're doing, for what part are you using offsetting, and what have you done besides offsetting, I think these are already 3 principles to follow.
That's great. Very helpful. And
Yes, just to reflect on Dr. Umar and Leah's comments, the UNFCCC, when they determined what were eligible projects in the forestry or red spectrum, said that 1990 was your cutoff. So if you deforested before 1990, effectively that forest would be eligible for claiming credits if you were doing reforestation, afforestation, sustainable forest management, etc. Just one example from YTL, when we're having discussions about what potential there was. We've only got one project in YTL, which was the substitution of palm kernel shell in the cement plants in place of fossil fuels, in place of coal. And that was, I think, still remains one of the largest carbon credit projects in Malaysia to date, issuances per year. But what they asked me was, we've been blending cement for years, aggregates such as blast furnace slag, fly ash, copper slag, etc. We've reduced our carbon emissions by about 30%. So 1 ton of cement used to produce about 1 ton of CO2. We've brought that down to around 700. Now, this is not an official figure, it's just an estimate, around 700 kilograms per ton of cement. We can't claim that as a carbon credit project because we were already doing it. So it's not additional. So additionality worked both ways. It rewards the people who deforested before 1990, but for somebody post-1990 who implemented a project, but it wasn't registered because the methodology didn't exist in 1995, won't get rewarded. So clearly there was something wrong with the system, and you don't see what was possibly the proper reward system and penalty system or punitive system to actually reflect the activities on the ground. So I think hopefully this is one thing that we corrected. And as Leah said, due diligence is critical in the way you assess these projects, but essentially it boils down to the frameworks and standards.
Great, thank you. So at the corporate level, there are a number of standards. There are a number of bodies. They're all, nothing's perfect, but they are converging and they're getting better. Now, from the investor standpoint, there would be a concern that they would be accused of greenwashing if they were invested in companies that are claiming net zero or claiming X carbon emissions, but a portion of that is driven by voluntary offsets. How should investors look at this? I mean, there's no right number, but what would be the rule of thumb for investors looking at companies to determine whether they should be allowed to use offsets or whether they really need to change something about their operations? And at what stage should they be able to include offsets?
I might start the ball rolling, Graham, and then Leah and Ralph can kick in. I think it's a very difficult question, the rule of thumb. So I do caution our audience today. For example, the exchange. My biggest problem is my grid. So I can avoid, we'll put up solar, we'll do all these necessary things, but my footprint is actually because we run servers, we're running a market, and where am I getting my electricity from? And so I'm using that as an example to share with the audience how there is no rule of thumb. We need to understand what a business does and how that business is tackling the problem. I will have to buy offsets or renewable energy certificates for their scope 2, as the case may be. So we avoid, we reduce where we can, but there will be some that we just cannot avoid. And so we need to understand, as analysts and looking at corporates, what are they doing? What is their conversation? So it actually gets back to that theme of disclosure and also making sure disclosure is measured, the objectivity around the piece. So we move beyond pretty pictures to figures that make sense, that are objective rather than the subjective element. So, I mean, just phrasing the, if you like, rephrasing the question.
I think also, if I may add to that, I think the question on to what percentage offsets should be used maybe is a bit a different angle, right? The way I would see it if I was an investor is, what is the company doing to decarbonize besides using offsets? Because I think that's often a bit of misconception, because I don't think necessarily they will be conflicting, right? Because what do offsets do and what should they do? They should allow you to put a price on carbon today, to take responsibility for your emissions, and to offset emission that you cannot avoid today because technology might not allow you. Now, that should still not stop you from decarbonizing as much as you can and as fast as you can. So instead of maybe looking, what percentage would be okay for a company to use to offset, I would rather look into what is their overall decarbonization strategy, how serious are they, how are they making progress, have they calculated their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and how are they working on that?
So no matter how much we want to, we can't just simplify it into a single number, I think is a fair assessment. Now, we do have some questions in from the audience, quite interesting. So we'll kick off first with plantation companies in Malaysia say they are able to generate clean energy from biogas plants in the milling process. How will they be able to certify this and sell these credits? I mean, very specific, which makes it very interesting in my view. I think any of you.
Thanks. So we have, under YTLSV Carbon, we've assisted about 35 companies, largely in Malaysia in the palm oil sector, to register biogas, biomass, and other methane avoidance projects. So absolutely, these projects are perfectly eligible. They do avoid a very potent greenhouse gas with a global warming potential of around 25 times of that of CO2. The same thing for landfill gas. As long as you're capturing as long as you're obviously mitigating. I think that, for the palm oil sector, just like any other sector, it's a necessary, there are certain exclusion sectors which I would say maybe, should not, or perhaps would not be eligible. But, palm oil clearly is like cement and steel. It's an essential ingredient. So the projects that we're talking about in terms of future development, we are seeing a little bit of a discount on pricing for certain sectors. Unfortunately, this is the reality. It's not necessarily something we believe is correct, but that will probably continue to be the case.
Great. Thank you. Quite clear. I think we could go on to the next one. This is a bit broader. Who should bear the costs of cleaning up the environment between consumers and producers, and within the producers between shareholders, labor, and government? How can we avoid a situation where the smaller guys have to pay for the bigger portion?
That's a very broad question. And it's also has a number of value judgments in place. I think the key is carbon has to be priced in. And in pricing in carbon, unfortunately, we will all pay. So it's not the little guy, it's everyone. Now, in my mind, there's a broader conversation that we're going to have to take place is, applying a value judgment, if I may, there's been a lot of conversations about banks not funding brown, moving to green, looking for sustainability. And, TCFD is real. It is coming to the banking sector, 2024. The basis of calculation and what is the role of bank, there are green funds available, there's access in the Malaysian context, you can get lower funding. And so how do we bring everyone along on the journey together? So as a large corporate, and not focusing on banks, let's look at ourselves. Do we ask for the calculation as we green our supply chain, looking at our scope 3? And if we see a supplier who is not achieving our objective, do we cut them off or do we engage them and move them on a journey? So that is a value judgment. Ourselves at the exchange, we bring people along on us with our journey. We educate. And so I think what we're looking for is there not to be this binary conversation, good conduct, bad conduct, but engagement and moving all of the economy along on that journey, if I can, Charles. So carbon will be priced in. We will all pay for that price of carbon. But as we make that transition, and we talk a lot about that just transition, I think there is a role for responsible corporates to lead. We cannot replace government, but we can play our role and lead on greening our supply chains, which has a positive impact. It's virtuous. It then moves the supply chain forward and also creates greater opportunities for these smaller companies to grow. Quite often we're asked, why spend so much money? It's not spending money, you're investing. You're in a competitive market. Wouldn't you want to be able to differentiate yourself, your product, your company from your competitor and take their market share? So be an early adopter and do it.
Good answer. We'll bring it back down to something a bit more straightforward, particularly since we are, again, at an EV conference. What role do carbon offsets to voluntary carbon markets have in decarbonizing the EV supply chain? I think that ties into what you were just talking about. And quite separately, but where are there opportunities to sell carbon credits from EV infrastructure to help fund EV infrastructure or other parts of the EV build out?
Yeah, I can start on, and then I guess the others can add. I think carbon offsets, the great thing about carbon offsets really is that they can bring financing to projects that wouldn't be otherwise commercially viable. So they've done that with another of different project types and project technologies, that when the technology cost was so high, they provided the additional finance that at this point in time was required to make the project commercially viable. Now, at the moment, the technology costs for EVs, for the vehicles, but also for the infrastructure are still quite high. So ultimately, what offsets can do is to provide this additional financing and make those projects viable and help them to scale.
Thank you. Ralph?
The only current project I think is registered is the CRX EV accelerator. Again, as Leah said, these will promote the development of the infrastructure and also electric vehicle adoption. And I think so far Gojek has signed up for this, and it's going to originate in Singapore, will spread throughout the region. So clearly you have to link up these projects. There has to be a stimulus, and this methodology allows that to take place. I think it's a Vera methodology, isn't it? The EVA. Clearly there are other potential mechanisms or methodologies available which are going to stimulate further transition, because your EV is only really as good as the energy going to charge it. So the transition into other fuels, so solar, particularly for this region, perhaps a degree of wave or tidal power. Clearly we don't have the benefit of wind, but there are going to be technologies available over time, and obviously we mustn't discount the potential of technologies like small modular reactors as well in this whole process, and the hydrogen economy. I think that's something that we mustn't write off yet for the hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles.
Thank you. And would you like to comment on opportunities for supply chain, I think, to purchase offsets and have that be a part of their strategy to decarbonize, particularly as the auto OEMs, the global OEMs, are coming under a lot of pressure to prove that they've got Scope 3 net zero?
No, I think, Charles, you've said it. It is the opportunity in itself. So the question is then, what is an acceptable credit arising from that conduct? And as Leah said, the voluntary carbon market presents an opportunity because it's all about additionality. It's creating value. So emissions trading, a compliance market is punishment for bad behaviour. Voluntary carbon market is reward for good behaviour or doing good. I do see it as that binary at times, although it is rather simplistic. I do appreciate that. Now, as we move along the EV path or looking for better solutions for transportation, the voluntary carbon market represents an opportunity to help fund that transition and actually allocate resources where it needs to be to make projects which would otherwise not be viable. So I think it's a very strong tool.
Fantastic. Thank you. We've got a few questions to try to get through. I don't think we'll get them all. Apologies in advance. But this one, from the perspective of national interest, would it make more sense to focus on project-centric or jurisdictional, or take a jurisdictional approach? Is the latter viable?
Thorny issue. I think it depends on where you are on your journey. At this point in time, clearly on what is your aspiration? So net zero, it's probably jurisdictional, national, focusing on what we need to do for the country. As we build a market, we're actually looking at projects and what does it take to actually create supply to meet demand and build a whole ecosystem. Now, we are very confident in our mind that as we grow, there will be more than enough domestic demand to meet domestic supply. And so we're very much focused on our ambition. We see a theme, the crowding out of domestic purchases by foreign purchasers. You can't buy Indonesian credits offshore anymore. So I think this is a real conversation that as we all aspire to achieving an outcome, there will not be enough supply to meet the needs as we transition our grids, transition our transportation, those things that we need to do. Also bearing in mind, what is the ultimate lifestyle product, Charles? Energy.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would have guessed that, but absolutely, it's you can't do anything without it, clearly. So with that, there are a few. Okay, this one is going to be tough, but any guidance on what would be an optimal price for 1 ton of carbon? Yeah, now, already know, based on everything you've said so far, that there is no single optimal price. But if we had to look at carbon prices out to 2030 or 2050, I mean, are we still in that kind of sub $10 range? Are we in a $100 range? Are we in a $50 range? Is there any kind of number we could peg at all?
I'm afraid, how long is a piece of string? I mean, the sum of two halves. I mean, I'm being a little bit flippant, but it is very difficult because there are too many imponderables. There are too many different elements. What is acceptable conduct? What is happening in the world? How is technology evolving? My lens isn't strong enough to look that far in the future, Charles, if I may. What we do is we look in terms of what is in front of us. We know projects are 3 to 5 years. I'm sure Leah will echo this. We look at this, what is in front of us today, and what we're aspiring to do and trying to achieve, and that guides our pricing.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't be able to give a number here either. But I think what the price should look like is, I think it should be able to do two things. One would be to make sure that if the price is high enough, that also higher projects that come at higher abatement costs would be interesting. I think that would be really relevant, because I think at the moment the market has been focused quite a bit on projects and kind of on the low-hanging fruit, right? That's what everyone is doing. But I think we also need to make sure that other projects become viable and become interesting also from a carbon perspective, right? And I think if the price for voluntary carbon increases, then that is likely going to happen. And then I think secondly, if the price for voluntary offsets goes up, then I think the whole question around, are corporates using offsets instead of decarbonizing also fades away, because the price gets so high that for them it wouldn't be attractive at all to use offsets instead of decarbonize. So the case for transitioning becomes even clearer. So I think these are the two kind of key things that I hope to see the carbon price doing in the future.
Thank you very much. And yes, I understand. Just giving a number is, once again, it's too simplistic, as much as we'd love to. Okay, and with that, we've got the red light flashing. That time is up. Thank you very much, Omar, Leah, Ralph. I don't know if we've quite answered all the questions we set out to, but we've gotten admirably close, so I appreciate that. And thank you all for your time.